So Laura, do you want to help me introduce Rachel and Allison? You have so generously put this together for us with having our speakers today. Oh, Laura, you're on mute though. There you go.
There you go. So I got really excited just a couple of years ago finding out about learning stories and about using that as a really authentic way of assessing. Went to a conference actually at OCD, I think a couple of years ago, and took a bunch of the California mentors with me and literally spent most of my time crying through the whole thing because it was like, finally, we're getting back to really seeing children as the unique, wonderful people that they are, instead of having checklists and all of these other ways that we tend to put children into boxes. And got super excited about EDUCA, well, learning stories, and then got connected with EDUCA. But they're really bringing this program, you know, they're in New York, both Allison and Rachel. And so we, anyway, I'm using it right now. I'm teaching practicum for Saddleback College, and am using learning stories as a way of kind of helping students to understand that, you know, that cycle that we go through of observing children, planning based on that observation, and then assessing and then planning the next steps, which is so easily done with learning stories. So I've known Allison and Rachel for a couple of years now, and I'm really impressed with what they're doing with learning stories to bring it here to the United States.
Thank you, Laura. So, hi everyone. I'm Rachel, and I am going to let you know that most of the time today, while I love speaking, and I see a lot of familiar faces who know I love to speak, I will be handing most of today over to Allison, because if you don't hear this noise in the back of my house, I had a flood from my daughter's bathroom straight down to the main floor, straight down to the basement. And that happened because she went to the bathroom at 13 years old. And at 13, we're not checking after them after they go to the bathroom. I should write a learning story about this. Addison, you went to the bathroom. I'm so glad that I don't have to come in after you. However, the toilet was overflowing, and it kept on running, and it kept on running, and it kept on running. And at about 5 in the morning, my husband said, "Why do I hear water?" So if you ever wanted to put a waterfall in your house, I have found a way. And so we have these really loud fans and dehumidifiers going on. I have to have a lot of work done on my house, and it's been very stressful, but I'm really happy to be here with you today, because this is really, I love my job. I love what we do. I love learning stories, and I love working with educators, because you are some of the friendliest, happiest, kindest faces I see in my day. So thanks for having us. So Allison, do you want to just pull up the PowerPoint real quick? I'm going to give a little forward on who we are at EDUCA and why we're here. And once I hand this over to Allison, I will monitor the chat, and I'll mute myself so that if you have questions throughout, I can answer them. But EDUCA, just so you know who we are, our company actually is based in and originated in and is still based in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, which is where the practice of learning stories originated, educators were writing learning stories by hand to their children, about their children, who they were working with, and sharing with families. And they realized pretty quickly over the years that the world of the digital age has grown. And so EDUCA actually was an answer to helping educators move from paper to writing learning stories in a digital format and sharing with families. I was actually brought on to EDUCA to help bring EDUCA to America. And I figured out really quickly, educators in the States and in Canada, most of them have never heard of learning stories as a practice. And yet I would walk into, I see people in the waiting room, sorry, I just want to let them in. I would walk into schools, and while most of my educators never heard of learning stories, nobody was saying, but I love my checklists. Nobody. You know, educators are miserable with checklist assessments and having to, what I call deficit teach, you know, fill out these assessments, checklists, and then go back and kind of fill in the gaps. And how do we do that? You know, you're teaching them in a way that's not child-led, and that's more in response, what I call deficit teaching. And so the very practice of writing learning stories is one that really promotes a child-led journey, watching children, observing children, seeing what they're learning, seeing what their interests are, letting children take the lead. The children themselves are the lead teachers. We're their co-teachers. We're there really just to kind of help them grow. But what happened after I came to my company and I said, you know, I really, and I'm not here to sell EDUCA to you. I'm not here to sell a communication platform. I'm here to really, I shifted gears. I don't want to sell you anything. If I'm going to sell you anything, it's the practice of writing learning stories and then and you could do this with EDUCA, you could do this with anything. If you're interested in EDUCA, call me another time. Right now, today, we're here to talk about just the practice and share what we have found is a growing movement. And the movement is learning stories, which is a heartfelt, authentic way to assess children and share with families, which does what? It lets children be themselves and grow authentically while we're helping them and giving them tools to grow further. It's then naturally helping grow our engagement with families who are our co-teachers, right? Their kids should be learning, we know 50% at home, 50% at school, and now with COVID, they're there most of the time as well. And then if we're using learning stories and building a community of practice within our schools, which we all should be, that's the best professional development there is, right? Communicating with each other, collaborating and sharing, and we all know that. You're all here today for that very reason. If we're doing that, then we can use those learning stories to have different lenses into what we're doing in our practice and coming up with ideas and sharing and stretching our practice and coaching each other. And so the organic growth of EDUCA in the States became really working to help grow the practice of learning stories for children, learning stories for communication with families, and learning stories to write to each other, our colleagues, to help stretch our practice and observation. And then what's happening? We have new up and coming teachers who are at the university level, and many of them know about learning stories. They're teaching to their students who will be the future teachers, or mentor programs like Laura's. And we can use learning stories in so many ways. We can have our mentees write learning stories, bring them back to the classroom. We can go over them together and help them look for learning dispositions and give them ideas. And we can even write learning stories to our mentee students, and they can write them to us about what they're learning from us to help us stretch our practice and see if they have picked up on the things that we're teaching them or giving them to practice in their classrooms. So today, you know, we really thought a lot about what we were going to do today. I'm so glad now that we have an hour and a half and not an hour, because you see, I'm not going to talk that much, and you see what I'm doing, right? I'm yakking, right? I can't help myself. I get very passionate about what we're doing here. But I'm so glad you're all smiling, because that's good. It's a good thing. Hopefully it's contagious. But, you know, we thought about it, and I don't know how many of you, and it's really hard. You can't, like, I don't see all of you right now. I just see some of you. I'm going to start scrolling through and looking at your beautiful faces when Allison's talking. So put your videos on. But I don't know how many of you are super, like, knowledgeable about learning stories and what they are. And I'm sure some of you are, and I'm sure there are some of you that maybe are new to learning stories. So what we are going to do is we're going to kind of like break this down into a little recap, you know, and I don't want to apologize to those of you who are familiar with learning stories, because in my mind, there is no better way of like going back to the basics and getting excited about something than to revisit the basics of what something is, and maybe you hear something different, or maybe it just reinforces what you're already doing. So we're going to go over a little bit of the basics of what learning stories are. We're going to go a little bit into the different ways they can be used, like I just mentioned to you, and give you some examples. We'll show you a little bit of how we do that inside of EDUCA, which is versus doing it by hand. And then we can answer any questions that you may have, and I can answer any questions along the way through the chat, or if there's something pressing that I'm like, yes, everybody needs to know this, I'll pause and stop Allison from speaking. So on that note, I am going to zip it. I'm going to mute, but I will be on here, and I'm going to let Allison take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. It's so nice of you to be here on a Friday and join us. As Rachel said, I'm Allison. I work at EDUCA, but I have been teaching for 21 years prior to this, or 20 years prior to this. You know, I started when I was 15. So this today we'll talk a little bit about learning stories. Rachel did a great intro, so I don't need to go through a whole lot more with it. I'm also going to touch on how you can use learning stories in your community of practice, whether that be in a class, a consortium, amongst colleagues, or even what you're doing now when you're alongside colleagues, having coffee, discussing issues. That's also another way to bring in learning stories into your life. I can't really see my slides, so I need to move this. Hang on a sec. So I love this. Tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe, but tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. One of the things I always say to teachers when they say, I'm not really sure how to write a learning story, I say, when you go home from work that day, because being an educator is a very different kind of work than other people, and someone says, this is after an hour of not talking because you're so sick of talking, but someone says in your family, a partner, how was your day? What happened today? And you're sort of filled with stories of, oh, you know, little Rachel said the most amazing thing, and I saw Laura have a breakthrough and do this. This little Donna came up to me and gave me this cookie and said this. Those are all, in a way, learning stories. So when I think about how to start a learning story, I always think about what moved me from my day. And because teaching is a matter of the heart, lots of things move us. Story moves us. So what is a learning story? Basically, a learning story on EDUCA and in many other places as well has three parts. The first is the story written to the child about the child. The second part is what learning is happening here. This is where we interpret the learning. Whatever it is we saw in the story, what does that mean for this child? Not for all children developmentally, but for that particular child. And then the third part is opportunities and possibilities. What's next? How can I think about what I saw in a formative way? In other words, if I saw Rachel do something really neat today and have a breakthrough or develop a new skill, how can I help her build on that? And what plans do I have? It's also a great way to interact with the family and engage them. So today I'm going to talk about learning stories in US practice, and learning stories in communities of practice, sort of where you might be coming from. So this is my son, and what are learning stories? So a learning story has three parts, as I said. This is how it looks in EDUCA. This is sort of makes it easier for teachers to write them. We're all very busy. So there's a title, there's a story, what learning is happening here, and what's next. You can also connect to frameworks, especially if your state requires a framework. Let me just move all of you guys because I can't see. Here's an example of a learning story that I'm going to read to you because everybody likes a story on a Friday afternoon, right? So this is called I See a Red Door and I Want to Paint It Black. Lucian, you always blow me away with your amazing creativity and your willingness to share your art with others. Today, I watched you paint a beautiful picture that included many bright colors and textures. One by one, you added colors in long, broad strokes. When you seemed satisfied with your work, you took out black paint and with the same broad brushstrokes covered your painting. I watched as the colorful painting slowly disappeared from the easel. You began to remove the painting from the easel and said gleefully, "For you, Miss Regina. I have a large collection of Lucian art above my desk at school and in my home. This masterpiece in black with its secret colors beneath hangs above my desk for all to see." So that, my friends, was actually an assessment. That was the learning story, written to Lucian, about no one else. The second part is the what learning is happening here. Lucian, for you, art is more than just a way to explore and try things out, although you did experiment with black, didn't you? Painting over the colors with black was a bold artistic and creative decision, Lucian, and I loved it. Also for you, art is for keeps. You want to share. I was honored that you chose me to be the recipient. At this age, young children value process over product in art. While we love a beautifully colorful painting, it's important to let children explore. So there's where I interpret what I saw in the story. And the third part, what's next? Opportunities and possibilities. Lucian often shares with an intent to share versus just to show an object to an adult. I'm impressed with this aspect of his learner identity. What types of experiences do you provide Lucian at home to reinforce this sharing? So again, we have the story. We have the what learning is happening here and the what's next. Learning stories don't need to be long. Actually, some of the most impactful stories I read are quite short. But one thing they all have in common is they're written to the child, talking about their unique interests and their development. And they try to engage the family there at the end. If you notice in the what's next, I asked the family, what types of experiences do you provide Lucian at home? I do get a great answer actually from them with that question. So what's going on here? Of course, we know that in early childhood education, we value process versus product, but the family might not know that, and even Lucian might not know what he was doing. And so what I've done here is I've caught this in a snapshot, this one moment in time for this child. The family is transported to that moment, the child is transported to that moment, and it lives on forever. I'm not quite sure that report cards kind of carry that same emotional weight like a learning story, so I find them to be incredibly just meaningful to families as well as to children. And then in the what learning is happening, I can kind of explain that in family-friendly terms. I'm not going to get into a lot of stuff about fine motor skills or that type of thing, but all of that is certainly going on. And then in the opportunities, as I said before, we move on and think about how I can provide for Lucian next. I can connect any of this to a framework, and then just in EDUCA and a lot of different systems, there's a place for families to comment. And you can see here, Ms. Garcia comments, "This story makes me so happy. We're so pleased to hear that Lucian is sharing at school. This makes sense because our household includes Lucian's grandparents, aunt, uncle, and brother Alejandro. With so many of us under one roof, Lucian learned the importance of sharing early on." Great. So this ends up becoming a family story, and family stories are fantastic. Ideally, a child's learning story portfolio or the whole of their assessment will include a number of individual learning stories written by their teachers or important adults in the center. It might include some group learning stories and hopefully some family stories. So this is a family story reacting to the learning story that I wrote. And in it, I won't read it to you, but in it, the Garcia family explains that family is incredibly important. They talk about a holiday, the grandmother reacts. Just in our system, you can connect all sorts of adults to a child. So we have just in New Zealand, we actually have a child who has something like 18 different adults connected to the profile. What that means is when a learning story is published, all of those adults can see it. One of those adults is this child's grandmother who lives in India and has never met him. So she only knows this child through the learning stories. And while it would be great to send photos of your new grandbaby and send photos and talk about them, a learning story really gives that grandmother a full sense of who that child is. But I'm digressing. So again, there's that picture that you might get sent home. And if you have children and if you've been in teaching for a while, you've sent pictures or received photos of what's going on in school. So here I have a photo of a child interacting with an archaic device, which is a phone. And that would be cool. I would love to have this photo of this for my child. But what if I had the context? What if I had the story behind it, told to me and told to that child to capture that moment? So I'm going to read you this one really quickly because it's very short. This is called Making Small Talk. Talking, laughter, squealing, and ringing. This is what I heard when I approached your telephone corner this morning, Fawn Lin. I watched as you dialed a friend and yelled and screeched in the phone. You were having so much fun. You clearly love chatting with friends and family on the play telephone. Wei, you would say, as you answered an imaginary ring, and how when your friend on the other line said something that pleased you. It was clear that your telephone was only for good news. So in the What Learning is Happening here, I bring a little more context about Fawn Lin. The background here is that Fawn Lin, her family primarily speaks Cantonese. And so there was a bit of a language barrier there between the teacher and the child. And this is the way that we kind of engage the whole family. Let them know that their child was heard, understood, and cared for. So what learning is happening here? Just yesterday, you asked me what the telephone was, and I explained. I showed you how it's used in historic times. You immediately adapted your understanding of this exotic device and applied it to imaginary play. In the what's next, this is a great way for me to engage with that family, and I say, do you have a telephone at home? Do you often talk to friends and family? And as it turns out, Fawn Lin talks to her grandmother in China every 2 weeks, and now there's something else I know about Fawn Lin. So we really get to know our children through learning stories, and as you can probably imagine, after reading hundreds of learning stories, Rachel and I really get to know who the teacher is. I think this is important for practice. Every time we tell a story, we impose our subjective understanding of that event, but we also tell the reader a little bit about who we are as a teacher, our philosophy, and how we care for children. And so that really comes through. So let me move you guys because you're in my way here. So learning stories, there we go. Learning stories really link learning chains. I always like to say that. They provide context. They're formative versus summative. They provide setting. And right now, I feel like in a pandemic, setting is so important. When the families are nowhere near the center, you're really giving them, what does the center sound like, look like, even smell like? You can do that in a story. Like all good fiction, it's going to have a great setting. Show a journey of learning or emphasize a new discovery. So there can be these longer chains that are mentioned in a learning story. Give voice to the child. Some of the best learning stories we read have quotes from the child in it. Show emerging learning dispositions. Essentially, the goal is to better understand the child, as you can tell. But because early childhood education and education in general is about building relationships, learning stories also form strong bonds between the caregiver and the child. When that learning story is read to the child, that reinforces that the child has been observed, that the child has been listened to, and this is worthy of writing. So each time we read a learning story to a child, it kind of, I guess it reinforces their learner identity and gives them a sense of belonging in a way that other things can't actually. So we get parent engagement versus involvement. We empower parents by saying, hey, I'm bringing you into this learning. It's great if you provide snacks for class or volunteer. All those things are good. That's a type of involvement that's often necessary. But engagement empowers them to play a role in their child's learning. I think that's important. And of course, it also provides a voice for cultural identity. When we get to know families, we get to know their culture. So I'll move you guys again. Just kind of quickly here, a rundown. The way a story works, I will make an observation, and then I will change that observation into a story written to the child. In the What Learning is Happening here, I want to ask myself, why is this observation important, noteworthy, or unique for this child? How can I describe this learning in family-friendly terms? Especially graduate students tend to rely on some of their they've got an arsenal of new jargon for education. So the good thing to remember is keep it family-friendly, keep it for a non-educator, and you'll reach your audience, I think, a bit better. The what's next, I might ask, how will this learning impact future learning, and how can I engage the family in the learning process? If I am connecting to a framework, which measures can I select that align to the learning framework and therefore provide context? So I'm kind of a visual learner. We've got the observation, becomes a story. That creates an opportunity for family engagement, which could inform future learning experiences. I'm going to reflect upon that and I'm going to start observing again. So this is a cycle. Now, you know this as educators, you do this with your own students, and your students are doing this with this is very meta, they're doing it with their students. So this process is familiar to you. But there's lots of ways to interpret it through assessment. And I think learning stories are really unique and accessible. So Rachel, do I have any questions? Because you know I speak really fast. We're from New York.
Nope. I'm just reminding a couple of people that this is being recorded, so they will have access to the PowerPoint. And if they need any other kind of resource, they can always reach out to me directly. I'll put my email on the chat, but keep putting questions in the chat if you have them, guys. And we're here. I'm here.
Thanks, Rachel. And so as per our other discussion, I hope you guys don't take my recording here and pull me out of context. I'll try to keep it clean. So group versus individual stories. Because we know that learning is a social endeavor, whether with adults or with the little ones, when you write a group learning story, you're really capturing that moment, and so much of education is about the social interactions. In this case too, the social setting will provide context and meaning. It's an opportunity to talk about what's happening in your classroom, and the group learning stories both affirm individual and group identity, which are two major things. So you'll see this is a group learning story here. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can see that there are 7 children in this learning story. That means I won't necessarily address every child by name, but I will talk about what's happening in the center. That's one type of group learning story. This is an interesting group learning story. At this particular center, a mud kitchen was created, actually through parent volunteers in the backyard of this urban setting. And so the teacher just allowed the students to go out there and have at that mud kitchen. And you know how this works. Children were playing together, but actually they were engaging in parallel play. And so that's a great opportunity to discuss how all of the children were interacting with the mud kitchen in different ways. Just as with an individual story, group stories will have the story written to the children, what learning is happening here and what's next. Again, if you connect to a framework, it's also great, and you can do that with all of the children. So that's just one example. One thing to remember about learning stories that I find really meaningful for practice is that learning stories are meant to be read to children. They are meant to be kept at eye level. And this is just an example of my daughter's learning story portfolio. It's just a 3-ring binder. I can add to it. I put the plastic sleeves around it so they don't get yucky. And children will often go to their learning story portfolio, pull it off of the shelf, and ask teachers to read it to them because it's their favorite story. It's a story about themselves. And so when we write the assessment to the child understands and feels that they are heard and understands what the assessment is. So this is very meta actually too. This is a learning story about children loving their learning stories. So you see a couple kiddos here that are reading their learning story portfolio. They do not read, but they have them memorized. So they're sort of reading them to the teacher. That's like a dialectic process there that I think is really neat. How do I, this guy's in the way again. So one of the things, my favorite thing to do at EDUCA is to teach learning story pedagogy. I think that's kind of my favorite piece. Also, the differences between family engagement and involvement are big, and the support of new teachers. So if we think about a community of practice and professional growth, in many ways, learning stories are sort of ideal. Much of what we want to do when we assess, especially teachers, is write this in narrative form, is discuss it with them. Teaching is heavy on the extroverted discussion. And so I think learning stories really do that quite well for community of practice. So right now, I'll just talk about this. I'm not sure that you use the term community of practice, but if you do, a community of practice is basically groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do. Again, I can't see. Do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. In many ways, what you're doing right now, even though I'm doing all the talking, is a kind of community of practice moment, because as educators, you're meeting on a Friday afternoon and discussing issues. So the community of practice that we have worked with in the past have been university cohorts. They can also be professional learning communities within a school or center, be used for professional development, or even educational organizations. So in the COP, storytelling really builds trust. since education is a kind of vulnerable moment for us. When you're first learning to teach, you feel like you're on stage. You may feel like you're being judged. When you're nurturing and mentoring young teachers, you want to develop that trust. You want to be able to say, you can do this. It takes practice. So you have to be able to accept feedback. Storytelling also unlocks passion. It can be non-hierarchical. I can't speak today. And storytelling nurtures communities. The kind of community that you want to nurture here could really benefit from, I still can't see this, from learning stories. So the question often comes up, for whom should learning stories be written? And my answer is everyone. Learning stories form these strong bonds between mentors and peers, which we know are important and will contribute to a teacher's confidence going forward. They promote active listening. Sometimes it's hard when you're meeting with your mentor teacher or professor to listen to all of the feedback you're getting. So you can think of the learning story as a story narrative of your professional development as a teacher, your practice. And of course, personal and professional growth. Any questions so far?
Nope. This is this group right now is a community of practice group. So I think we're speaking their language.
That's good. I like to speak the same language as you guys. So the highlights that we can do are, in terms of just practice is a mentor-peer collaboration and dialogue. And I think that learning stories do a great job of that. And teacher professional portfolios, I'll show you that in a second. Learning story approval practice. So one of the neat things that if you're working digitally that you can do is before a teacher would publish a learning story, it can first go to their mentor for feedback before sort of going out to the parents and becoming this thing that's out there. So that's one possibility. And some documentation. So I'm just going to kind of go through a little bit of this here on how to use this platform. If you were thinking about doing that for a university cohort, you would have a normally parent-facing but student-facing feature called the message board, where you'd be able to post different ideas, resources. So I'll show you how some people are doing that on EDUCA right now. And each teacher has their own, profile. And you can group different cohorts. So if you teach a number of classes, or if you teach a number of cohorts, or there's a remote group and there's an in-person group, that can be easily, you can toggle between those easily. And I know it's all really hard. Just listening to you all talk about remote teaching and some of the pitfalls and difficulties, challenges with remote teaching, something like this could probably help. So how do we transfer the learning story process that I talked to you about earlier with children to adult learners? I think in many ways, if you start off in an education class using learning stories, then you're going to end up with this teacher who is going to be thinking in narrative form about children. So the more you can personalize it, I think the better. This is a teacher here who has a personal statement and some development notes that lives here on EDUCA. So all of these different pieces will be here. Every story that teacher will write will also be here. But I kind of like the concept of portfolio posts. So building a portfolio for your class, or building a portfolio just for your own practice by creating these posts. This can be a reaction to a conference, a reaction to a reading or an article, or even a discussion, and a reflection on an observation, because many of your teachers may be student teaching at this time. Again, here it is, the observations, inquiry, questions, documents, and basically a way to record and reflect upon professional and personal growth. This is what it looks like in EDUCA, similar to the way it looks like a learning story. And we've seen a lot of centers, especially related to, they will write learning stories for their colleagues and also reflect upon the stories in the portfolio post in that same kind of dialogue. One thing you can do as well is connect to professional standards, which I think is pretty good. But when you're thinking about these portfolio posts, and when you're thinking about writing learning stories for your students and your students writing learning stories for one another or colleagues, it's always great to think about what questions do you want to help lead it, like an outline for a story. In my case, I came up with these. How does this story and or evidence relate to your role as a teacher, and describe opportunities and possibilities, or where to next for my teaching practice? So similar to the child learning story, we've got the story, we have the evidence and how this impacts your role as a teacher, and then thinking ahead. So sort of self-summative assessment, and also formative assessment and formative assessment of your colleagues. You can share these with your mentor or your peer on EDUCA before you hit publish. So again, there's a message board, and I think that's important when discussing things. I'm just going to show you some examples of what's happening at EDUCA right now that I think is really interesting. This is a group called Teachers as Learners, and you can see that they're just starting off, and they're creating this message board where they're going to post different resources and react to them. You can also do book clubs, and I think this is very cool. This 100 Languages of Children book, obviously everyone knows this book, is being discussed at a couple of our centers in Ohio. And so these comments got sort of out of control, like loads and loads of comments, really wordy. And so the director said, I think it's time for you guys to write some learning stories about this. Learning stories about how the 100 Languages of Children and Reggio approach impact your practice, and very reflective, all living there in the child portfolio. And then there's documentation, assignments, forms, certificates, all of that can be kept there also on your portfolio. So rather than go through and demo all of this, I think in EDUCA, I just wanted to say these are the things that EDUCA can do. And that's a little bit out of order. The other thing I wanted to open your eyes to is that EDUCA has a number of webinars that are free for your students and for yourself on all matters ECE and on learning stories. There's some really great ones, some famous folks who, and also webinar replays. If your students or you were to watch a webinar on EDUCA, you do get a certificate of attendance, which is kind of a nice thing. And there's also a ton of different articles and blogs on early childhood ideas and learning stories that you can use as material in your classes to discuss. Okay, so I think, how long did I speak for?
Gosh, you quick. That was quick. It's a quarter to 5, and you zip, zip, zip. So a couple of things. I'm really excited to see that we did get some feedback. No questions yet, but we'll open it up to questions if people want to, jump on and say hi. But we did get some feedback. Someone wrote, I'm taking notes and absorbing. This is great information and perspective. Which made me stop and think about just the joy of writing a learning story versus a checklist for a child allows us to have perspective about that child and what we see, which is often missed in education, but a very important part of relationship building and letting families know that you see their child and are getting to know their child and are listening and paying attention and collaborating. So perspective is just so important. I love the word perspective. So that's great. I had someone who wrote, I am excited to add learning stories for the assessment piece in my ECE literature course. Love it. And oh, thank you, Kim. Kim just wrote, yes, Rachel, profound. That's me, So anyway, no, Laura wanted me to mention frameworks are available to you. So, you know what, you want to stop sharing just so I can see everybody for a second? Because I want to see I want to see all your faces. Can we do that? Okay. And if you want to put on your faces, like your video or your sound, that's okay. It's all right. It's not a beauty contest. And so one of the reasons I didn't dive in, or Allison didn't dive into frameworks, is I never want to like come on and sell you EDUCA, right? Like, yeah, I would love for you to call me and say, I want to use EDUCA to do all this, but I didn't want that to be what this is about. However, if you were using EDUCA to write learning stories, we have built into the platform framework. So if you're using DRDP, which in California, most of my sites are, as opposed to using DRDP as a checklist, we actually use DRDP as it's intended, which is you're writing your learning story and then you're using your DRDP for planning, and it's more of a footnote to your learning story. So you're writing your learning story and then you're linking to the measures that are being met within your story and then using that to plan next steps, as opposed to using a checklist, anecdotes, sending and pushing out information to families. So yes, any framework is available in addition to not just state frameworks, but we do work with some sites that have specialty frameworks, or like I work with ELEA and they have faith-based practice frameworks. So we can link to anything, but the heart of what we do always comes back to learning stories. So Rachel Johnson just wrote, in talking about note-taking with students, have you heard conversations, resources about anecdotal note-taking versus story note-taking, and how students or beginning teachers and their skill development and the different type of notes? Yeah, so the main difference, okay, with anecdotal evidence is teachers tend to post their pictures or their videos and like I say, push out information. This is what we did today. With a learning story, we are taking that observation, making it personal, and the piece that's often left out, intentionally or not, just because we're forgetting, or is that very intentional what learning is happening here for this child or that group of children, and the what's next. The what's next is so vital and so important. In fact, when Wendy Lee and Margaret Carr developed this practice of learning stories, they didn't have that third part specifically written in initially, what's next. Didn't mean they weren't intending to do it, but they didn't write it in. And they realized that teachers were not putting that in to their practice. And they went back and they added that in. Because if we're not taking our observation and what we see and thinking about how to stretch that for kids, offering those opportunities, then we're missing a really important part of why we're assessing to begin with. And I always like to give an older student example because it really puts it in perspective for us. My kids are older now. They're 16, 11th grade and 7th grade. And I say the same thing is, regardless of the age, if you're giving a student a test and you're getting a grade, if the student or the group of students, my son came home one year, he had a 70 something on a science exam. I'm not really one to get stuck on a grade, but he's not a 70 student. He's like, a high 80s to low 90s student when it comes to science. And there was one year where he came home. Laura, you've probably heard the story over and over again of mine, right? But he came home, he had the 70 something on a test. And he said the whole class bombed the test. So my answer was, oh, okay, so what did the teacher do? Like, did she go over it with you? No, because we already moved on to the next unit. So you're all nodding, right? Isn't that annoying? So I'm like, well, I don't understand. If the whole class did badly on the test, why'd she move on? Or not pause and go over it with you? He goes, well, she has to do her next unit. And that's when I had to step in. Okay, like that's what you're hearing the Bronx come out of me, right? I had to step in and really just ask the teacher, like, I'm just not sure. And I don't know if I actually asked the teacher or if I asked somebody at the school. I think I actually went to someone at the school first. I was like, I don't get it. If we're giving a test and everyone does poorly, okay, the first thing I would do as a teacher is say, well, what did I do or not do that my kids didn't get this? Was it the test itself? Was it they didn't capture the information? Do I need to go back and do a reteach? we need to think about our purpose and why we're assessing. And if you're taking the time as an educator to observe kids and assess them, don't you owe it just to yourselves to think about those next steps and why? Right? It's your time.
Rachel, do you mind if I just jump in for 1 second?
Yeah. You see, I'm getting crazy again. I'm flipping. I get so passionate about this because it's like, oh, and somebody, I'm sorry, wait. And someone just, it also flips the learning and like those that look at what a student is learning rather than what a teacher is teaching, the perspective on what the child is learning. I love how it reframes how DRDPs are being used, and I'm going to use it. Yes, Becky Roth. Yes.
So,
you get it, right?
Rachel, so Rachel was also asking the question about note-taking when it comes to anecdotal versus learning stories. And this came up recently in a webinar that I was moderating that I wasn't doing. And someone was asking about the note-taking process for learning stories versus, say, an anecdote like work sampling or TSG or whatever kind of thing. And one of the ways that the speaker described it, and I think I would agree with this, is that when you're writing a story, you're jotting down highlights of like what are important points, because we are giving a snapshot, and some of those are going to be extremely subjective. When you're doing an anecdotal or clinical kind of note-taking on a child, it looks very different from when you're really responding to a child's strengths and the changes in their interests. I might write down that I'm so surprised that sort of little Amanda suddenly got interested in painting when she hadn't before. I'm going to write down my feelings as well and some sort of highlights, because if you're writing a story, you do want to have it be an interesting story. And so I think in many ways, the note-taking for learning stories versus anecdotal can be more subjective, it can be more emotional and more dramatic. I guess that's my answer to that. I don't know if I
yeah, and that, no, I'm glad that you mentioned that. What is interesting is I do have a lot of teachers who've been teaching for many years who say to me, this is what I used to do before I had to do this checklist, but now there's a name for it, or this is what I've been wanting to do and I haven't been allowed. It's like they're given permission now to use their voice,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been teaching for a really long time, and when we teach people how to do anecdotals, it's like, tell just the facts. We don't want to hear what you think about it. We just want you to state the facts. So all of the emotion of it, it's just the details of like the child did this, how they did it, you can explain it, but there's no emotion, there's no reflection, there's none of that happening. And so it's almost like, you have this amazing thing that the child did, but when it's written in that way, it's so clinical, it sounds so basic. And I was teaching an assessment class, and we did all of those assessments. We learned how to write anecdotal notes. We learned how to do the checklist. We learned how to do DRDP and class and all of the different assessments that we do in California. But I also introduced learning stories, and we walked over to the lab school, and the students wrote learning stories. And then at the end of the term, I asked them, of all of the kinds of assessments that you did, what resonated the most with you? And all overwhelmingly, they all said learning stories. It just makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And it's so wonderful to be able to share your excitement about this child finally figuring something out, or discovering something new in the classroom, or finally building a relationship where they've had difficulties with that in the past. And to me, it just brought life back, like, oh yes, thank you, God. We have this breath of fresh air of really valuing the uniqueness and the wonder that children are.
Absolutely. I do want to point out that very often teachers, let's talk about the objections to writing learning stories, because I always like to keep it real. The biggest objections I get when I'm presenting on learning stories, there are two. One is, I'm not a writer. And I always want to point out, as Allison said earlier, that you don't have to be Maya Angelou, right? I mean, you just need to write from your heart and write even as though you're writing a letter to a child. And it's okay. It's okay to keep it simple. So, you know, that's one thing. The other objection I get is, but I don't have a lot of time. You know, the big clock on the wall. Everyone's nodding. And when we write learning stories, one learning story on average hits anywhere from about 8 to 12 measures of those frameworks. And so if we're writing 1 to 2 learning stories a month, your work is going to get done, and most likely you're saving time than having to go back and fill in. And you're like, oh my goodness. Now, I know Patty had her hand up to say something. I apologize, I didn't see right away. Where's Patty? Oh, hi, Patty. You have to take your mute off.
I was going to try to write a question in the chat, and it was a little convoluted because I realized that even a learning story is a very personal thing about a relationship with a teacher and a child. So when I heard the example, I was puzzled because to me, so much of the example was about the wonder of having color and then covering the color, had very little to do in my mind with sharing the painting. So then I realized, but I didn't know that teacher or that child and the times you spent together and what you knew about that. So to ask that specifically, and so it almost occurred to me, it might be interesting to have more than one person write a learning story about the same activity, because for the person who wrote that one, they were talking about the child's interest in sharing at that point. I totally saw the whole art piece, the process. And so I would have written, as the teacher in that scenario, I would have written a different learning story. But the other part that's hard, because some of us are also describing what it's been like over time with the field, is that what I want from a learning story, and knowing just a little about it, is that wonder and that enjoyment. Not like I can find another way to make my assessments work. Look what I wrote it this way, and then I met it with. I think almost like if the learning story is really going to be authentic, really authentic, not again just a substitution for the checklist assessments, then the heart does flow, and it will be a flowing thing. Otherwise, it'll just be another way to solve somebody's workflow answers. Question I have, though, in terms of the system that has been to offer it to other people, is how often would you expect a teacher in a classroom with the full classroom responsibilities to do learning stories? And is it as the spirit moves them, so to speak, or is it, I'm really going to be committed to doing a learning story on this child this week, or how does that work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The first thing I want to say, just so you said a lot of really great things. So the first thing is, when we're writing a story, the way we have EDUCA set up, and this is for one of the reasons that you mentioned, is that you can share a story with a peer or a mentor before it gets put to the family, so that you can get that other lens to look at that story and offer their ideas and insights. So that's one of the reasons, based on what you just said. And yes, that wonder and enjoyment of the moment does shine through. In terms of number of learning stories, I will tell you that yes, there has to be a mixture between when you have that moment where you're seeing something to write on that whim, but most of our sites that we go into will say, set a requirement. We want you to write at least 1, if not 2 learning stories per child per month, because you need to write about, I would say, 2 a month per child to hit most of your measures that you need for your data purposes. But Allison, do you have anything more to add on that?
I was going to say that Rachel's kind of bad cop, because I usually say, Patty, I say 1 learning story per child per month, and I get like a ton of smiles from the teachers, but Rachel's bad cop, so she probably tells them too.
Well, let me just point out that it could be an individual story, one per child per month, but then you're also writing a group story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so, you know, group stories are really important because no matter how much we're trying to keep it personal, we also do want to point out the shared play and imagination and the things kids are doing together. So that can count as a story for, it does count, right?
Yeah,
so, but yes, that's what.
The other thing that has come up recently, Rachel, is actually with a couple of centers that I was working with this week, they were, so they're used to these checkpoints, 3 checkpoints a year. And they were, I mean, I think me just sort of saying, write a learning story authentically when it comes to you was just really not cutting it for them.
Yeah.
So when I spoke to the director, she gave me that feedback that you can't just be this sort of like spiritual guru who says, write them when they come to you, because these teachers are very much used to these checkpoints. So my answer is usually 1 learning story per child per month. And like, don't, you know, set up a situation. This shouldn't be artificial. It should be authentically kind of unfolding. If you don't know the child well, then wait a little bit longer is what I say. But, you know.
One of the things that I would point out to you if I were showing you the EDUCA platform is that what we've done and put into place is there's like a reporting tool where you can see how many stories you've written for each of the children. One of the reasons I do that is less, oh, you're welcome, Melody. Thank you for coming. Melody has to go. Hi, Melody. One of the reasons we do that is, you know, look, you need to do what you need to do. Okay, we can't stop that. But we also want to check our equity, right? And that we tend to, when we're in a class of kids, sometimes just without even realizing it, we have that sort of bias towards certain kids that we're writing more for and less for others. So we do have tracking where we can see and just make sure we're writing for all of the kids. So we have that. I would show you that if I were, like I said, if I were showing you the EDUCA platform, which we're not doing today, but we do have sort of checks and balances put in place so that we make sure we're doing what we have to do as well. Any other questions?
There were a couple of people who had their hands raised, but I'm not really sure. This is
Donna. I see Donna has her hand raised.
Oh, okay, good.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. What I'm about to say sounds really terrible, but I think that we have to be aware of what people might not be saying about it. And I'm just going to preface this with, this is not what I believe. But I have had students say to me, and this is usually like in my developmental psych class where I get a whole broad range and they're not all like the nice ECE people like we are. I've heard some people say we're creating a, you know, sort of a generation of narcissists by, you know, this all talking about them. And I mean, you know, this is how I raised my daughter. I think she turned out okay. But I think that we need to figure out a way to make sure we say that ahead of time when we tell this, because they're going to be, you know, the quiet students in your class that don't say anything, then they walk away and they go, are you kidding me? You know, what are we turning these kids into? So of course, you know, I think, you know, we start with the idea that children are, you know, when their cup is filled, you know, they know who they are, and this is a very healthy thing, health promoting thing to do. But yeah, there will be those who are thinking but not saying, you know, this is creating a generation of narcissists. So
yeah, I mean, that's like, do we keep using positive reinforcement only, or do we talk about the you know, negative and the consequences? You know, I think there is a place for not just highlighting the growth and the development and the wonderful things, you know, so, you know, this is a positive approach to assessing, and but we're not saying, you know, in that what's next, that's the time where we're talking about what other things we can be doing to stretch this child's journey and practice, and things we can be working on, as well as connecting it with plans for that child. So that's much more of a constructive way of addressing those needs, right? So if we're using, I would say this is less, you know, building this sort of like, you know, persona of a child than anecdotes, because if you're using like sort of anecdotal evidence or like hi mamas of the world, you're pushing out all these pictures. Parents are saying, oh, look, my child's doing so well. Da, da, da. Whereas with this, maybe you're getting a little less of that, but you're getting really, very real, authentic growth and development with the discussion of what's next. So, I wouldn't, this is not a sugarcoating of a child. It's a real observation with learning development, but we are addressing what are our next steps? What is the plan to work on with this child? And it could even be, we're going to move on because we do see that there's a need to work on cooperation more with this child or inviting other kids to play. So here's our plan for that. And then when you see some of that success, writing a story. So I'm not really concerned about, over inflating the child's ego and the parents seeing that, because we're tying it together with learning and what we're doing next. Does that make sense? Okay. I just want to see something. Someone wrote you would have the example you need for DRD to measure to assess some learning strategy. With the students in our platform, this is all we have to use. Okay, Kim is inspired. Oh, you're welcome. Sharing learning stories. Okay, so the one question that I got from a couple of people is if we're using like EDUCA with DRDP, is this all we have to do? Because teachers, I'm tying a lot of these comments together. Teachers often say they have so much documentation to put out there to meet their DRDP measures. And that's one of the benefits of learning stories, is that you are meeting those 8 to 12 measures from one learning story. So that's where I say you're saving time, as opposed to like, plucking different leaves to get to all your measures. And it's a much more authentic way of filling those measures in real time. So I would have to show you that in the EDUCA platform, which I'm happy to do. Like I said, I keep I've been on so many webinars where I'm like, okay, this person's really just selling me something, and I cringe at that. So I'd like to be mindful. Rachel and I were having this discussion before. So if you are interested in my diving into how we do this in EDUCA, just email me and I'll give you a one-on-one webinar on that and show you how it all ties together.
Yeah, we do have a way to enter anecdotal evidence when you don't have a learning story for something. I mean, so the one that comes up all the time for me, the question that teachers ask is, I don't have a learning story about dresses himself and, wash his hands or something. And so there's a way on our platform anyway where you can put in anecdotal evidence there or connect to a story, but there doesn't need to be a learning story about everything. That's the other piece, because some of the DRDP it might not come up, I guess. And we do want it to come up authentically.
Yeah. Where's Donna? Did she get off? Or is she still here? Oh, Donna, you know what I was thinking about? I hope you guys don't mind. It's another personal story. So when my son, who's now 16, was in preschool, he had a lot of issues. He's on the spectrum. He has ADHD. He had OCD. Basically, if he doesn't have a Z, the kid had it, right? So he was in preschool, and I was the mom who would like run out of the classroom to try to poke my head in the window to see what they were doing. And I never really knew, but I knew we had a lot to work on, because he was playing alongside or doing his own thing. He wasn't doing things that I knew we wanted him to do. But, we're talking 14, 15 years ago, and I just didn't know. I would get home pictures with him smiling, or, oh, he had a good day today, but I didn't know what he was learning or how they were helping him with some of the things that I wanted them to work on with him. And I was doing the work at home too. I was always like, we all have to do this together. So I got a composition notebook, and I would write to the teacher anything I felt was relevant that day, good or bad or ugly. There was often ugly. And I would give it to the teacher just so that she felt like she had an understanding of what his mood was that day or whatever. She would then share it with his shadow or his see it, who, I don't know what you call it there, you know, who was in the classroom to help him, give it back to me. I would share it with his behavior therapist, and his speech therapist. So we were all on the same page. Now, I used to tell this story a lot, and then I guess I just kind of got old and I forgot about it. So now I'm going to just tell it to you guys again. So about 2.5 years ago, and Allison remembers this well because I had a whole group of teachers in tears when I told the story because it had just happened. I decided to go through all the things in his bins that I had saved. I had the 2s bin, the 3s bin, the 4s bin. I had all the turkey handprints. I had all the thing, you know, all the stuff. I got rid of everything except, well, I kept a couple of things, but really one thing that I saved. Can you all guess what that was? What? Allison's nodding. What is it, Allison Schultz?
No, oh, sorry, I thought you meant me. Go ahead, Allison Schultz.
Oh, I can't.
Sorry, you kept the notebook because it was the most meaningful thing.
It was the most
And it was
meaningful
really
thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
and a really great snapshot because it went back and forth and back and forth. So it was that family connection, and
It wasn't
had
all good
everything.
stuff. Like I said, there was some ugly stuff in there. There was some major perseverating meltdowns in there. But there was also so much growth and good in there. And that was the journey. I have the chills now as I'm revisiting it to you. I could cry. That was my learning story portfolio that I didn't even know we were doing because I didn't even know what learning stories were back then. I wish we had an EDUCA and we had teachers writing learning stories for every child. Every parent should have something like that. That tells me more about how far he's come than any freaking turkey handprints that I could get, right? And the crazy thing is, after I went through preschool with him, I knew exactly what I was getting sent home for every holiday for when my daughter got into preschool. Right? The book, the composition book, was so valuable to me. I will save it forever. So it didn't have just the good, but it had the growth. I think that's a really good way to end. Does anybody else have any comments or feedback, or you want to just, you know, anybody have any helpful tips on when your house has got a waterfall, a leak from the top down? Fun times here. No. Oh, you're welcome.
I've been
Don.
through that. It can be trying, but just keep breathing. It can be tough.
Yes, Keisha, I agree. Keisha wrote, it would be a great thing for your son to have later in his life as well. From your lips to God's ears, because my son, he's like, okay, leave me alone. Stop. Now he wants nothing to do with me. Okay, so you know he's come a long way. 16, he wants nothing to do with me unless he wants me to take him to practice driving.
Right.
Typical 16-year-old. You're all very welcome. I love this. And, you know, really, we can do it again. Feel free. My email I gave in the chat before, but it's Rachel, R-A-C-H-E-L. I'll do it again. Rachel at GetEduca. GetEduca.com. Oh, you're very welcome, Alma, Patty, Lorraine.
I just want to thank you for taking your time out, Rachel and Allison, to come and talk with our community.
Anytime. Well, I would like to say next time I'll come out there in person, right, Laura?
Yeah, we would love to be out there. Not yet.
Well, not right now in the rain. If people are coming to California, they should come to sunny California, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. For the good and the growth.
You might want to also mention the salsa conference that's coming up.
So you know, there's some interesting shifts with that. So I don't know if anyone here raised your hands if you came to the EDUCA Salsa virtual conference. Okay, well I know you did, Laura. Okay, So we're co-hosting that again, October 2nd. It's a Saturday, October 2nd. Please, everybody, mark it in your calendar. Hilltop, which is a wonderful school in Seattle, is hosting, they were supposed to host the in-person in June event, but with COVID still running rampant, they're going virtual. But what they're doing is they're getting creative and they're splitting their conference into like, I think it's like 3 or 4 days of multiple different things that you can do. And so like you buy a ticket and you can go to any of the events, or they'll be taped so you can go back to them. So there's a lot of offerings. I will email Laura the flyer that Mike Brown, who's their, oh, actually Allison just posted the link into the chat, but we do have a flyer that he just sent me, and I'll send that to you as well, Laura, if you wanna send it out to everybody. It should be really interesting. And I actually think, Allison, you're going to be speaking at that, right?
Yeah, just in case you guys want to hear my voice some more.
Yeah. He asked,
Actually, there's famous people speaking. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be like highly attended, but yeah.
No, I actually think she will. Don't let her. She's very modest. But I will, I'm actually helping him. He actually wrote me yesterday saying he wants to pick my brain about some ideas. So I'll keep you posted as any developments about the conference come up, but I will definitely send you the flyer so you can sign up for it.
So what does SALSA stand for?
SALSA stands for, oh my God, what does SALSA stand for? Learning story. Oh my God. Allison, what does SALSA stand for? Can you look that up? I always forget what SALSA stands for. Something Learning Stories America.
Supporting the advancement of learning stories in America.
Yes, supporting the advancement of learning stories in America. So SALSA is a nonprofit, and their mission is to spread the practice of learning stories in America, exactly what it stands for. And we got connected with SALSA quite a few years ago now, and somehow last year's conference landed on my head, and we got really connected with them, and they're just so, our mission is really the same, to grow learning stories and share this knowledge and experience. And so I just, such a great group of educators. So October 2nd is the next one we're sponsoring. It's the virtual, and we're going to start, I think, actually next week, our committee for that, to determine what the theme is going to be and start working on that. Believe it or not, now it takes a little time. And yeah, 8 days, Allison, is the Hilltop? Yeah, they're ambitious. Hilltop's doing this 8-day thing, and I'm like,
Instead of you can attend one weekend, one another weekend, or something like that. So I'm pretty sure it's 8 days. If not, I'm really close, but it's quite a few.
yeah, better than them than me. So mine's 1 day. Yeah.
Well, thank you, ladies, for sharing that. That'll be a great resource to put up. If you don't mind, we'll put it up on the EC Faculty Collective so people can go back and look at it there as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And again, I want to thank you. This was actually, Laura actually suggested we have Rachel and Allison come join us. I'm so glad that you did, Laura. Thank you for that.
Welcome.
And if any of our members have something that they want to share, don't hesitate to reach out. On March 3rd is our next coffee chat, and that's actually being run by a couple of other of our members, and they're hosting a Zoom tips and tricks workshop to help you when you're teaching online on Zoom. What are some things that you can do to make yourself even more effective on that? So again, it's our members coming together. And Laura, I already have reached out to the exec team of the COP to start talking about planning a mentor discussion.
Awesome. Thank you.
Because I know that you were very concerned about that, and that's something we should be concerned about. So we're going to bring it there. And then also on Monday, we have a meeting with Tri-CE, CE, and Peach, and so we'll bring it up there as well. to see
Awesome. Thank you so much.
what we can do about that. So if we have to come through and write another set of letters to the chancellor's office and go bang on the door virtually, I'm sure we can do that.
Maybe we just show up.
With all of our masks on. We'll need to get like
Right.
mentor program masks that we can all wear to show up.
That's how I can spend my budget this.
There we go. Alma's eyes got really big, so I think we need to, I think we're onto something.
All right, guys, so I'm gonna actually hang up and figure out dinner because we're 3 hours ahead of you. But if you have any questions, just, absolutely reach out anytime.
Yeah. And Adela, if you are not on the ECECOP mailing list, just send me your email private chat and I'll add you to the mailing list so you can be included on all these conversations.
Okay.
Rachel, where should we go for the recording if we want
I will
to?
be sending, after I get it, I'll send it out in an email to that mailing list.
Okay.
And we'll also post it up on the EC Faculty Collective when I get a second, and it'll go to the TPP website as well. It goes up on there as well.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I know I will be wanting to go back and looking at this again.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. Have a great Friday.
Bye.
Let me stop recording.
Bye, Patty. It was nice seeing you.